It's over. It's over. It's... Space. A continuous extension interval between planets, stars and other objects. These are the critiques of the critic McElvoy. His continuing mission to review strange new shows, to seek out new work and new bastardizations, to boldly note what no critic has noted before. That's right, kids, it's over. 60 episodes, 7 years. And finally, we're free of Mick and her crew of big-hearted, hugging degenerates. Star Trek Discovery was in production for longer than Star Trek The Next Generation, but 111 fewer episodes were made. For that, we must be eternally grateful. What might surprise you is that of those 60 or so episodes that were made, not one of them proved to be memorable. Critics Loggers, you've followed the show week in, week out for the past 7 years and 5 seasons. I am going to say that that record of the show is perhaps the only one that will survive it. Long after memories fade of what it was actually like to watch Star Trek Discovery, those critics' logs will be there. And I'm going to be conceited enough to say that one day, when Star Trek is owned by someone who likes Star Trek and is keen to consign this era of it to the netherworld, who knows? Maybe this video will appear on the extras and on a special Star Trek Discovery Trekkies edition, Blu-ray, 4K, Steelbook, whatever the fuck it is. You know? Because you and I know, don't we, that we were ahead of the curve. We knew what was really going on while this was happening. Not hindsight for us, kids, not reappraisal in 20 years' time, but an actual, intuitive understanding of why this show was not a good Star Trek series. It never had any hope of being a good Star Trek series because it was written and run by misfits and people who didn't understand Star Trek. And that will never change. People might decide that they like this version of Star Trek, but let's be unequivocal. It's its own thing. It's a little bubble of Trek branded nonsense which has got nothing to do with the Star Trek that you and I love. If you can internalise that, and I'm sure that you can, you'll have no difficulty realising that this entire episode or episodes has been really a tragic and expensive waste of time. Not one memorable story in 5 seasons, just 5 really awkwardly made, meandering serials, which didn't seem to have much shape or focus. First 2 seasons in particular were effectively a game of consequences, with different writers passing the story onto one another without any real idea of where they were going or what they were doing. This has been a strange show, Star Trek Discovery, a show in search of a format. Every other Star Trek series at least knew what it was from the beginning and might have made tweaks, in terms of tone or emphasis and so on. The Next Generation famously was a bit haphazard to start with, but its fundamental premise, where it was set, who its principal characters were, what type of stories it wanted to tell, was pretty well understood by Gene Roddenberry from the outset. Writers desperately tried to interpret that in different ways until settling on a formula that worked for everybody in Star Trek The Next Generation's third season. But no one, except Maurice Hurley, of course, who was the showrunner for TNG in the first year, no one except him, and he was slightly insane, suggested tearing up the whole thing and starting again. It's like, oh fuck, none of this works! Let's completely change the format. Discovery, you'll remember, began its life as an anthology show. Brian Fuller envisioned a series that would have each season set in a particular period in Trek chronology. The first season would be a TOS prequel, but the second season might be set, I don't know, in the TOS movie era, the third in the TNG era, the fourth in the as yet unforeseen future. And in order to try and mix things up a little bit, they put a different emphasis character-wise. So instead of each show being led traditionally by a captain or a commanding officer, they'd put the emphasis on maybe the number 2 in command. And that's where the idea of Michael Burnham originally came from. But in the hands of Alex Kurtzman and his cabal of hacks, talentless hacks, the whole concept was perverted into a crude, violent, visual reboot of Star Trek, which was, we're told, canonically aligned with the original series, but of course in reality it's an overwrite of the original series, just as Strange New Worlds is an overwrite. You have morons like David Mack, a very good author, a brilliant Star Trek author, but a fool when it comes to this canon issue, goes on Twitter and says to people, hey, there's no difference between Discovery and the TO. Who are you to say that one is canon, one isn't? Who am I to say? Well, as a fan of Star Trek, as made between 1966 and 2005, I presume to be the one to say that Star Trek Discovery does not exist in the same universe. And that, David Mack, if you're watching, and I know you're a big fan of Critic's Log, it's fucking obvious to anyone with eyes! Just watch Discovery. Watch Strange New Worlds. Look at the way that elements from TOS have been appropriated and perverted and watered down. And you can see, if you've got any brain at all, that these two things cannot be aligned. And if they cannot be aligned visually, thematically, in terms of character action and backstory, then they are not of the same continuity, and therefore one must be canonical and one must not. And I know which one I pick. Overwriting Star Trek canon is an insult to every Star Trek fan. You invest in those stories, you invest in those characters, you invest in that universe, and then you're told by a group of backward nimrods that none of that counts any longer, and that this show is it instead. No, forget all that stuff that you used to love. That's gone now. We've overwritten it. Imagine if somebody overwrote fucking Middlemarch and said, oh, by the way, I think George Eliot, not a bad writer, but here's a new version of that fucking novel. What if you're a literary person, you're supposed to accept that and go, oh yeah, sure. Shakespeare plays, well, they're all right, I suppose, but we've burned those and we've rewritten them. What kind of a world are we living in where we're supposed to accept that as an argument? How dare people presume to overwrite and destroy something which is culturally significant to so many people? And if you're one of those people who thinks that Discovery is part of the Star Trek canon, perhaps because in life itself you saw in Kovic's office Geordie's visor and you thought, oh wait, isn't it lovely how they've tied it all together? Fuck you! Just because they put a few Easter eggs in there to placate the idiots does not make it part of Star Trek continuity. Disco is a show that's been in such of a tone. It's a strange show. Long before it broke format and sent Michael Burnham and co off into the far-flung future for no reason at all. It didn't really know what it was in its first 2 seasons. It's this show full of violence and grotesquerie. Philippa Giorgio is eaten in the 2nd episode, I think. Or was it the 1st episode? Who the fuck remembers now? Read Critic's logs entries. That'll tell you. And this show that was all about action schlock and extreme violence, because that's what the people who write this show think constitutes gritty, edgy and adult. Stuff borrowed from franchises like RoboCop, Terminator, stuff that's got nothing to do whatsoever with Star Trek. Then had a sort of change of heart, and from the 3rd series onwards, of course, the show went into the 32nd century and became this sort of twee space opera in which the melodrama was heightened quite dramatically. For what purpose? To capitalise on the fact that the show was extremely popular, I suppose, with, shall we say, minority groups. And patronisingly, that's what they think you want to see. Are you gay, female or trans? Oh, well then you won't want, Star Trek as it was. You'll want this sort of big-hearted version. Everybody hug. And Tilly will embody all of you. Or Adira, maybe, with her pronouns of they and them. How ridiculous, how patronising. How stupid do they think the audience is? A show that changes format so dramatically is usually dead. It's usually dead in the water. You remember Buck Rogers? That changed its entire setting in its 2nd season. It was suddenly on the Searcher on a ship, sort of doing Star Trek-y type things. What an irony, by the way, that Discovery makes the 2nd season of Buck Rogers look like real Star Trek. If that isn't the most damning indictment of Discovery, I don't know what is. If you have a better one, put it in the comments. Discovery was bogged down by Star Trek continuity. It hated it because every boneheaded decision it made forced the producers to justify what they were doing. And in the end, they just got sick of it. They introduced Pike's Enterprise, for example, a shark jumping moment at the beginning of the 1st season. And that, as well as being a huge admission of failure, because it means that you haven't, of course, introduced any memorable or iconic characters of your own. And you haven't established your own show as a great series in its own right. Highlighted the desperation, the clawing at existing iconography to bolster this sinking ship. Let's asset strip Star Trek. That's all it is. Star Trek's just a lot of stuff. A lot of things that we can borrow and rework because we have no ideas of our own. But this canon adjacentness, if you like, caused problems for the producers. That's why they chose to break the format, change it up, throw the Discovery off into the future. And some of us thought, okay, maybe this is a moment where Discovery could be free to chart its own course, do its own thing. But it turned out that the writers of Discovery had no idea what was in the 32nd century. The 32nd century was empty. They introduced a silly sort of apocalyptic event, the burn, which was like a Dowd-like psychic projection from a grieving space child that destroyed the galaxy's propulsion capability. And that was a device in order to basically wipe the slate clean. Instead of envisioning the future as a rich place full of, developed civilizations and new technology and radical new thinking and ideas, it just became a sort of watered down version of Star Trek's past. They changed things around a little bit. They pushed the Breen to the fore and the Orions to the fore. And they merged Romulan and Vulcan cultures by putting them on the same home planet together. But really, they didn't have any idea what the 32nd century looked like. And its technology was not hugely imaginative. It was just a sort of slight modification of what we'd seen before. It could have been set 10 years after TNG. The idea that it was set 800 years after TNG is just absurd, given the paucity of ideas on offer. The 32nd century offered us nothing new. And in the vacuum, the writers tried to up the emotional and melodramatic load for the characters. They decided that Michael Burnham, who'd pulled her whole crew into the future and stranded them there for nothing, because of course they had defeated Control in the season 2 finale. There was no reason for them to go into the future. But they did go into the future. And Michael separated her crew from everything they'd ever known, everyone they'd ever loved. They didn't seem to mind, of course. They instantly forgave her. Why wouldn't they? She's Michael Burnham. She can walk on water. But they thought, well, she isn't really gelling 100% with the crew. She needs something. She needs a companion. She needs a man. Imagine that. Imagine thinking that your female protagonist, your lead character, can't work without the introduction of a male relationship. It's not very progressive, is it? A man will complete her. And so we got Book. And Book and Mick's relationship became the sort of unofficial focus of the series. And the rest of the cast, God love them, who had never really been fully introduced to us or fully developed because the serial format privileges plot over character every time, fell into the background and never really re-emerged. There was a sort of LGBTQ enclave on Discovery, Stamets, Culber, Adira, Gray, briefly, Adira's girlfriend / boyfriend. And weirdly, they didn't cross-pollinate with the rest of the crew. They just sort of stayed in this sort of minority bubble, which is not very progressive either. One of the ironies about Star Trek Discovery is that despite all of its progressive credentials, it's an incredibly regressive series, very backward in its thinking, backward in its representation of diversity. All of these things will date incredibly quickly. You know that, critics loggers. But some so-called Star Trek fans out there do not know this. They think that the show broke new ground. My God, Michael Burnham, a black woman, and leading a TV show? How progressive. Except that if you take away the fact that Michael is a woman and black, what you're left with is a character who was unlikable and aggressive and arrogant and full of hubris, who became a bit of an irritating know-it-all. You know, we could race swap and gender swap Picard or Cisco or Janeway, and those characters would still have a certain ability about them, a certain drive, a certain energy, which I suggest is not related to their gender or their race. Imagine seeing things in terms of something other than one's superficial characteristics. That's progressivism, is it not? But Star Trek Discovery is a show very much of its time. It's already dated. It's a show that will be remembered for finally concluding that the essence of life as we know it is diversity and representation. Is it? Is that what counts in life? Or is what counts in life being true to oneself and trying to lead a good life and a moral life and a knowledgeable life? To be curious about things other than yourself. Not be boorishly preoccupied with who you are, but what's going on in the world. Discovery's a great show for narcissists. Tells them that they're absolutely right to be navel-gazing all the time and focused on how they're feeling and who they are. Perhaps at the expense of everything else. Serialization was a problem in Discovery. It was too much for Discovery's writers. They were prisoners of meandering plots, these games of consequences that they couldn't control. And as the show went on, the plots became simpler. Season 4 was about a planet-killing thing that they had to understand. Right, got it. Now we can pause for some character melodrama while we try to solve this thing. Season 5 was a remake of the 1993 TNG episode The Chase, a scavenger hunt, if you will. An Indiana Jones-like quest for an ancient artifact which did something. We don't know. It didn't really matter to the writers what it did. They didn't know what it did. Because that's not really what it was about. It was just about sort of, hanging their episodes on something. And then they could take a step back and sort of, concentrate on interpersonal relationships. You'll recall Star Trek Next Generation Season 7, the season where the show lost focus because all of Trek's writers were off doing other things. They were developing the TNG movie. They were working on Deep Space Nine. They were developing Voyager. And in this absence, whoever was left in the limited time they had was told, just wrap it up. And their solution was to come up with ridiculous ideas. Let's tell a story about Geordie's mother, or Data's cousin, or Worf's son, or whatever. In other words, it all tilted toward interpersonal relationships and melodrama. That is a sign of failure. If that's where your emphasis is, you've started to write a soap, haven't you? You're not writing Star Trek anymore. It's fine to have these things as little asides in a much, much larger season. If you've got 26 episodes, you can afford to occasionally break format or take time out focus on a particular character's backstory. But if you're doing it episode after episode after episode, there's something missing. What is that thing? Science fiction. Storytelling. The emphasis on plot meant that many of the characters were never developed. As I sit here now, a couple of days after I saw the last episode of Discovery, I can't tell you, and I've seen every episode of Star Trek Discovery, remember, and I've reviewed every episode of Star Trek Discovery, and I still couldn't tell you the names of half the bridge crew. Because this kind of melodramatic guff puts the mind to sleep. And these characters, for the most part, were never more than background characters. The show was interested in Mick and Tilly and Book. Occasionally a little bit of Stamets. But for the most part, that's it. I defy you. Name every member of the bridge crew. Can you do it? You can't. Nobody can. And if I can't do it, and I've seen the whole show, there's no way you can do it. Privileging Mick and Book was fine. That's what preoccupied the Star Trek writers, but the audience were indifferent. Such a wishy-washy relationship, so one-dimensional. And these characters are far less interesting than the writers thought them to be. Characters that we would have liked to have seen developed were the people who did not represent a very general audience. The oddballs, the misfits, the outsiders. These are the kind of Star Trek characters that we love and have defined the show up to now. On Discovery, they were people like Saru, Tarina. How much screen time did they have in season 5? Probably about half an hour. Or less. That's a 10-hour season. You know, to use a footballing metaphor, Star Trek Discovery never knew its best team. They never fielded their best 11. They swapped people around, they brought in people, they killed off others, but they never really knew who their best ensemble were. And who gives a shit when it's all about Michael Burnham anyway? Stupid Michael Burnham, who starts a needless war with the Klingons, strands her crew in the future for no reason, but somehow, despite being 1,000 years out of time, is now suddenly the most important captain in the Federation. Do you understand how a crew that are 1,000 years out of time can be any good to anyone in the 32nd century? If a Viking turned up in the present day, would we stick them on a Royal Navy destroyer and say, "Hey, Captain, this"? What the fuck's going on? This is a show wasted opportunities, ladies and gentles. It was a TOS prequel that had no organic relationship with TOS. It's a franchise sequel that had nothing to say, nothing to show. The writers desperately borrowed plots from other movie franchises, Better Trek, served it up to us as something new. Made it look all nice and shiny and polished using state-of-the-art visual effects, which actually looked inorganic and synthetic, and made you nostalgic for model shots. Made you nostalgic even for stock shots. I never thought I'd say that, so that was a pet hate of mine. in the TNG era. The show jumped the shark so many times it's hard to recall all of the incidents. And then it dared to end by presuming to be this sort of bridge that encompassed every era of Star Trek. In the final episode, we learned that David Cronenberg, aka Dr. Kovich, aka Agent Daniels, was the Agent Daniels from Star Trek Enterprise, the temporal agent. And he collected little Star Trek memorabilia. It was a fan that collected Star Trek merch in his office. He had a bottle of Shadow Picard, he had Cisco's baseball, he had Geordie's visor. And this is the writer's sort of final fuck you to the audience, saying, hey, Star Trek Discovery is this thing that covers the whole expanse of the Star Trek universe, from Enterprise right up to the 32nd century. No, it isn't. It is an overwrite of Star Trek canon. Sorry, David Mack. Sorry, all the people out there who have written about what a groundbreaking show it was that's paved the way for other Star Trek shows in the new era. It's true to say that it's preserved the position of Alex Kurtzman as the franchise showrunner, but that is a fucking disaster. Shouldn't be in charge of Star Trek. He's a moron. The people who he's employed have comprehensively fucked it up. Is Star Trek any better? Is Star Trek enhanced because we have Strange New Worlds and Star Trek Picard? And Lower Decks, for fuck's sake. Lower Decks, stupid teenage level fan fiction masquerading as a Star Trek comedy. No. We haven't had a serious Star Trek show since Enterprise. We're not going to get one until these fucking imbeciles are out of the picture. There's no two ways about it. And with that, let's talk about the final episode, Life Itself. I didn't know what to expect from the final episode of this show. We'd been brought to a point where we'd been set up for a great revelation, something that was going to be quite extraordinary. The progenitor's tech. This great technology that had been the foundation of all life in the galaxy. Which is a bit irritating because one's inclined to believe that, life will have evolved on other planets without the help of one species. In the end, the last episode of Life Itself, of Life Itself, of Discovery, reminded me a bit of Dragon's Den. If you're watching in the US, that's the show that your series Shark Tank is based on. Entrepreneurs pitch ideas. You know the one? Why did it remind me of that? Because a common refrain in Dragon's Den is when an entrepreneur shows up with a thing and the investors sit there and they say, well, actually, this is a lovely idea, but you're trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist. And that's how I felt when Mick met one of the progenitors and learned that the purpose of the tech was to ejaculate stuff into the primordial ooze of thousands of planets to ensure diversity. Now, this doesn't really make sense, of course, because if you want diversity, why would you have a basic template? What's that? No one thought of that. Well, welcome back. Glad you've woken up. If this is my template for tape, and I make lots of different types of tape based on this design, then they are very similar. They are different, but they are fundamentally the same. Is that diversity? True diversity? Why is it necessary to spread your pattern across a galaxy when the makeup of different planets will naturally ensure different types of creature, all different types of species? Isn't the nature of natural selection and evolution that the species that gain primacy in a world will be the survivors, or the ones who evolve a certain degree of intelligence? Doesn't nature decide? So on Star Trek Discovery, a show that pretends to have some sort of tenuous link to physics and science in a way that previous Star Trek shows did, and this one doesn't, reaches a conclusion that actually it's necessary for a species to seed themselves in multiple planets to create effectively variants of themselves to ensure that there's lots of variation in the universe? Huh? That doesn't make sense. If you wanted to guarantee variation, surely the best thing to do would be to stay out of it. And how arrogant do you have to be to want to copy yourself and ensure there's a version of you in every fucking system in the galaxy? Doesn't that assume that a certain superiority? Isn't that eugenics? Let's make sure the strongest species survives. That's right. The plot of Season 5 of Star Trek Discovery was fascist. You didn't notice that, did you? In 1993, when The Chase aired, the TNG episode this season of Discovery was a sequel to, this was just a device to explain why every species the Enterprise encountered was humanoid. There's a bit of species essentialism there, of course. That's always been part of Star Trek. You know, humanoid species are the species we need to worry about. The Klingons, the Cardassians, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes, with a bit more money, we can have gelatinous species like the changelings, but the changelings, of course, manifest as humanoid. Budget necessity meant that this had to be the way. Of course, you couldn't have an alien of a completely different constitution every week. That wouldn't be financially practical. And so the genius of The Chase is it's a nice little joke, if you like, a nice little workaround to explain why most of the aliens we see are just like us, but with bumps or ridges or whatever. But if you think the idea through to its logical conclusion, as you and I have just done, you realise it's incredibly, intensely problematic. How funny that Star Trek Discovery, a show that prides itself on its progressive credentials, should end on a fascistic note. Star Trek has fucked up like this before, by the way. Remember What You Leave Behind, the ending of Deep Space Nine? Well, that ended with Sisko, a black man, abandoning his child. Just fucking off for an indefinite period of time, even though he joined a species that had complete control over linear time. He could have been away for centuries and been returned to the moment he left. But instead, he disappeared. After 7 years of building up his relationship with his son Jake, which was the founding relationship of that series, that was designed deliberately to usurp a stereotype that black men are irresponsible and they don't look after their children and they abandon them. The show ends with him abandoning his son and his wife, his pregnant wife. Star Trek Discovery ended by telling us that diversity was all that mattered in life, on a fascistic note. In a scene which had been borrowed from the Carl Sagan adaptation, Contact, the Robert Zemeckis movie. You remember that movie ended with Jodie Foster on a beach talking to an alien that looked like a dead dad. Remember that? There's a lovely little discussion about, reaching out across the galaxy to touch another species, not in an inappropriate way. A mixed discussion with the progenitor, who was a black woman, even though the progenitors are supposed to be a kind of neutral, raceless, generic humanoid form from which all variants are derived. Told Mick something wishy-washy and nebulous about it all being about diversity. And that was the moral of the show. Before that, there'd been a lot of fighting between Mick and Mole. Mole fulfilled her destiny as the kind of Belloc of this season by fucking things up with the progenitor tech. Turned out she couldn't revive Locke after all, because that was a myth. The tech couldn't revive the dead. Mole carried Locke's corpse around, in the pattern of it, and a thing on her arm, which was weird. Imagine carrying your lover's corpse around with you. Only on Discovery. Writers didn't really know how to create a sort of complex final challenge for Mick, so they turned it into a simple child's puzzle that she solved in about 28 seconds, involving some triangles. Then she met the head progenitor or a progenitor, the echo of a progenitor from the long past, and we learned that the progenitors weren't the progenitors. They were just custodians of this sort of Ionian-like part of space with lots of gateways to other planets and so on. And that it had been there, they'd found it, and so it had been built by somebody else. So they were the product of another arrogant species that wanted to propagate themselves indefinitely. And so on, and so on, and so on. The latest in a long line of races who thought they were too important to die out. And that was the final episode. How did it end? It ended a bit like the movie Titanic. Titanic, you remember, is one of the worst endings of any Hollywood movie. Any Hollywood movie. Kate Winslet goes to bed and dreams about being back on the Titanic with everybody there, all 2,200 passengers and the captain's there and all the characters we've met, and her and Jack kiss and the grand staircase and everybody claps. It was all about you. We're all dead, but it was all about you. You've both ascended into heaven. Brilliant. And here we are trapped with you, the memory of you, two people that we barely knew and didn't give a fuck about. We're all dead. This was a terrible tragedy, the worst maritime tragedy in the history of the world. We all had a horrible, horrible death, but thank God the two of you made it to heaven. As long as you two made it to heaven, everything's fine. Good on you. I'm glad you two got together. It's lovely when good folks get together. Brilliant. Mick had one of those visions. Her and the crew hugged. We hadn't seen them properly sent off because, of course, when they originally shot this episode, they didn't know it was the final episode. There was a conspicuous extra 20 minutes tacked on to the end of this episode, which was the wrap-up 20 minutes. What did they do with it? Well, they made it all about Mick, of course. We jumped into the future, and she was living in a, you've guessed it, like a log cabin with book. She had a son. He was about to become a Starfleet captain. And she sent the Discovery off on her final automated mission to wait at the end of the universe for something or other. Which tied into a short trek that no one saw, called Calypso. What lovely. And whilst sitting on the bridge of the Discovery, she closed her eyes and she had a, what was it? Was it a memory or a dream? We didn't know. It was very Titanic-esque. There's a sort of dreamy hue, Vaseline all over the lens. Everybody hugging, everyone bathed in sort of heavenly orange light. This following a scene in which Saru got married to Trina in a room the colour of urine. And everyone hugged, and it was sort of a silent ending. It's very much like everyone clapping. It's like, let's give ourselves a round of applause for a job badly done. And it was supposed to be sweet, but it was mawkish, awful, wordless. The only character's fate we learned about in the future was Tilly. She had become like one of the Starfleet Academy's longest serving teachers and mentors. Imagine that, Tilly! Silly Tilly. A vacuous airhead. Good luck, future Starfleet cadets. You're going to need it. So that's how it ended. That's how it ended. With hugging. And that was quite appropriate, wasn't it? Because that's basically Star Trek Discovery in a nutshell. We won't remember any of the stories. We won't remember the characters. We will remember the emotional highs and lows. We will remember people hugging and crying and emoting. And that's all. That's all there was. That's all there is. And it turns out that's all there ever will be. Just a lot of feeling. Does that make for a great TV series? Emoting, blubbing? You decide. But the answer's no! So, in the end, the final episode amounted to nothing. Nothing. There was no real conclusion. The Progenitors tech, we talked about it, didn't we? What's it going to do? What does it do? Why is it such a great threat to the Federation and every other in the end, it turned out not to be much of anything except a gateway to other places, which the Federation already has that technology, already has spore drive technology. It can already go wherever it wants, if it wants. So it turned out that the quest wasn't about the thing, it was about the message. And a la Indiana Jones and the Holy Grail, everybody ended up empty-handed. And a la Raiders of the Lost Ark, the tech was flung at Mick's insistence to the far side of a black hole so it could never be recovered by anybody ever again. Which is the space version of boxing it up and wheeling it off into that warehouse at the end of that movie. We knew it had to be that way because these writers had no concrete idea what to do with the technology. And so either you've got to hide it or you've got to destroy it. You know, a la the Genesis device at the end of Star Trek 2. But whereas Genesis was clear in its intent and in its consequences, there was never any clarity here, and it remained thus at the end. So Star Trek Discovery, this monumental exercise in foolhardiness and canon ruinization, or ruination to use the proper English. Ruinization! Ruinize Star Trek! Ended on a distinctly boring note. There were strange, surreal moments in this series. But unfortunately, all of that came at the beginning, and there was nothing by the end except hugging. Just hugging. I've sat through every episode of it. Every episode. To do something like this afterwards. Will someone hug me? The very final anomalous readings of Star Trek Discovery brings a tear to the eye. Not my eye, of course, but maybe yours. This was the 10th episode in a row in which the word shit was mentioned. Congratulations to whoever won that bet in the writer's room. Saru had a bizarre scene in which he managed to talk down one of the Breen Primarchs by acting like a crazed psychotic. This was the character that used to be a bit of a scaredy cat, scared of his own shadow. Until, of course, the revelation that they weren't prey, they were predators. One of the fucking weird plot twists in Star Trek Discovery. Progenitors acquired bulbous heads and racial differences, which sort of undermine the concept of a generic humanoid template for all people. We don't have bulbous heads, so why do they? They're supposed to be the sort of stick figure onto which you add clay. The progenitors talked about richness and variation, diversity in action. Of course, one of Star Trek's core ideas is infinite diversity and infinite combinations. But that, of course, comes from an understanding it's not just doesn't just relate to people's visual identity, it relates to ideas. The multiplicity of ideas. And Star Trek Discovery was notable for having very few ideas. In one scene, Mol had the Incredible Hulk's haircut. It was never explained why the Discovery had to be reverse engineered to look as she did in the 23rd century, to be sent to the edge of the galaxy to await a thing. In reality, she had to be reverse engineered to maintain continuity with the second season Star Trek short Calypso. But what in-story explanation was there for this? We were never given any. The writers just didn't know. They knew that she had to look like she used to look, but they didn't know. And the irony was, when she was returned to her 23rd century appearance, she looked exactly the same. Which kind of highlighted how little had changed in the 1,000 years since she was originally built, at least in the imaginations of this group of Star Trek writers. And as Tony Blair once said, that is that, the end.
But what is the life of one race compared to the vast stretches of cosmic time?
Well, Critics Loggers, it's been fun reviewing Star Trek Discovery, I think. But we've got bigger fish to fry. It's gone now. In the bio of this video, you can follow the link to the main Critics Log webpage where you can read or view an episode of every episode of Star Trek Discovery. And every episode of Star Trek Picard, if you like. And the first 4 seasons of Star Trek Lower Decks. And there's some other goodies on there too. It's been hard. Difficult. It's challenged our preconceptions about what Star Trek could be. We always assumed it would be an intelligent and engaging series. The writers of Discovery proved us wrong. We always thought that whoever our main protagonist was in Star Trek, we would love them unconditionally. Again, Discovery proved us wrong. We always thought that Star Trek would be a progressive show that looked to the future instead of just recycling the worst garbage in the present. We were wrong. We always assumed that the primary mission of all Star Trek writers would be to conceive fun and interesting, conceptually exciting stories for our consumption that were character focused and developed the core ensemble of each show. We were wrong. And the writers of Star Trek Discovery thought that they could write a good and interesting and exciting prequel and sequel to the Star Trek that we know and love, the Star Trek that was produced between 1966 and 2005. And they were wrong. So we were all wrong, and we must go away and lick our wounds. But we have to remain strong, because the people that formulated and produced this shithouse are not gone, ladies and genitals. They'll be back. Starfleet Academy is on its way. There's another season of Star Trek Lower Decks for us to look at. A Section 31 TV movie, which is surely going to be very hard on the eyes and the ears, thanks to the presence of Michelle Yeoh in the lead. But, as ever, we'll try to make sense of it together. And as ever, we will fail. Thank you for watching for the past 10 weeks. Thank you for reading prior to that. I'll see you again soon. Regenerated, I hope. I'm ready for another run in what's surely going to be a very, very difficult time for us all. Take care of yourselves, kids. Ed out.
Good fucking thought. You won't